Over 300 years ago, France erected a series of fortresses as protection against potential invaders. These exceptional and totally revolutionary constructions have stood the test of time. Today, these 160 strongholds continue to outline the French borders. This iron belt allowed France to revel in 100 years of peace during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King.
France became practically invincible in the 18th century.
At all corners of the country, the builders of the time managed to erect these fortresses on the most challenging grounds.
Building a citadel on a rocky outcrop more than 100 meters above the city is simply a colossal project.
Building a fortress in the middle of the ocean on a narrow rock, which has to be able to withstand cannon fire, that's an insane endeavor.
How were these constructions built to withstand centuries of invader assaults? And who is the genius behind each of these fortresses?
He invented bastion towers, which erected very high, and he built them in a pentagonal shape.
He built a series of floodgates all around the Lille citadel, which could be opened to flood vast swaths of land around the city to prevent enemy troops from advancing.
Faced with the evolution of weaponry, military strategists had to prove a lot more ingenious in order to defend the biggest cities of the territory.
Every 10 seconds, a cannonball hit the rampart. How could the enemy withstand that? It was inevitable that the city surrendered.
Thanks to the greatest military experts, to never-before-seen aerial footage, and to computer-generated reconstructions, you're about to discover the secrets behind the construction of Vauban's fortresses. Welcome to this journey across France and its fortifications that figure among the world's most remarkable. Whether he was building on a mountain, on a plain, or by the seaside, Vauban's style stands out from all others. He expertly designed these massive points, connected by low-lying walls, typical of Vauban's architecture. First built in the 15th century, this type of military construction was an answer to the development of artillery. When metal cannonballs became part of warfare, high stone fortress walls were no longer sufficient protection. Only one thing could absorb their powerful impact: dirt. The high walls and keeps gave way to walls of stone-covered dirt, the famous ramparts. The star-shaped enclosure was tucked into a ditch, making it almost invisible to the enemy. Defense had become a horizontal exercise. Vauban adopted this bastioned architecture and applied it to every French border as Louis XIV conquered new lands.
He didn't invent it. It had existed almost a century before him, but he perfected it to such an extent that his techniques were copied all over Europe and even the world.
Sébastien Le Prince de Vauban was born in 1633 in Vauban, in the Burgundy region of France. His family was not wealthy, but he received an education and quickly showed a talent for drawing and mathematics. When he was 17, State Minister Cardinal Mazarin noticed the knowledgeable young man and suggested that he join the Royal Corps of Engineers. Back then, Louis XIV needed reliable men to help conquer territories controlled by his age-old enemy, the Spanish Kingdom. The year was 1650. The Spaniards possessed part of the Netherlands and threatened France's southern, eastern, and northern borders. Throughout his reign, Louis XIV would lead successive wars to annex Artois, Alsace, and Franche-Comté in order to put more distance between Paris and the enemy. It was this war-driven surge that Vauban completed his apprenticeship under the Knight of Clerville, the chief commissioner of fortifications. Across the entire kingdom, and for over 15 years, Vauban increased siege warfare, built multiple fortresses, and became an unparalleled engineer.
He was technically a journeyman, an apprentice. And for an apprentice to become a master, he has to build a masterpiece. That masterpiece was Lille, the accumulation of everything Vauban had learned about fortifications under Clerville.
In 1667, Vauban's career took off when Louis XIV conquered Lille, then a Spanish stronghold.
During the conquest of the city of Lille, Vauban was noticed by the Marquis of Louvain, who was basically the Minister of War for Louis XIV, and by the king himself.
Louis XIV knew he needed to build a citadel to keep an eye on the city of Lille. He asked the Knight of Clerville to submit a proposal for its construction.
Clerville's first proposal was a quadrangular citadel, but the king didn't like it. As a result, Louvois asked Clerville to submit a new proposal. At the same time, he also asked Vauban, who was only 34 years old, to submit his own proposal, separate from Clerville's.
Vauban knew Louvois had given him an opportunity, so he went above and beyond. He developed a masterpiece. The terrain was flat, there was no obstacles to overcome, and his blueprints were perfect. Both the king and Louvois chose his project.
The Lille citadel is a perfect pentagon. The main enclosure is made of bastions connected to each other by curtain walls. Large cannons could fire from the bastions, while smaller cannons could crossfire to defend with no blind spots. Between each bastion, infantrymen provided short-range defense. They were protected by a wall, the tenaille, and a tapered structure, the lunette, where more infantrymen formed a second firing line. On the other side of the trenches was the covert way, also defended by infantrymen atop a gentle slope, the glacis, which is open so the enemy can be seen from afar. But first, the enemy had to approach the citadel, and Vauban didn't just build the fortress anywhere. He chose marshy ground to make the enemy's approach more difficult. On top of that, he refined a weapon the world had never used before: defense flooding.
He positioned the citadel so he could use the river's waters to create and control what we call a flood. It was brand new in the sense that he took what the Dutch had already developed and applied it to a much larger territory. Dutch engineers incorporated water management and hydraulics in their fortifications, both to stop water from coming in and to let water flow out. Here, that made it hard to approach the fortress by land.
The Doul River runs south of the citadel and across Lille. To use it in the citadel's defenses, Vauban developed a system to capture water upstream. He could then divert it to flood the citadel's trenches. But that's not all. During an attack, his brilliant system of dikes and floodgates allowed the flooding of 4 vast areas, cutting off the enemy's access to the citadel in all directions.
The idea was to have about 50 centimeters of water across the whole area. That meant the assailing troops, with their heavy cannons and carts full of weapons, would be completely bogged down and unable to approach the citadel. It basically prevented any strategic attack meant to conquer a city. Despite its innovative design, the citadel was built in record time.
2 years after the first stone was laid, it was ready to sustain an attack, and 3 years later, the massive project was complete. The secret behind this success became Vauban's trademark.
That's really when his career took off and his genius started taking shape. That genius was his ability to repurpose and improve what already existed, while always adapting to fit the terrain.
Before developing any fortification, Vauban meticulously analyzed the terrain, noting every natural element that could be used for construction. He documented the nearby materials, available workforce, and conducted geological surveys. In Lille, for example, when he dug trenches, he repurposed the clay to make bricks. As for building the ramparts, Vauban had 2 castles demolished to repurpose their stone, and he requisitioned sandstone quarries. The materials were transported via a canal that was specially built for the project.
His approach would have also made perfect sense in modern times. He would never have said, "I'm going to start with a clean slate to build this building in a brand new, magnificent city." Never, because he was always conscious of one key thing, which was time. He had to move quickly, but at the same time, he also had to build things that would last. And one way he could save time was by maximizing what was already there.
To accommodate 2,500 soldiers in the permanent garrison, Vauban had to innovate again. He designed the barracks with a full-fledged living space inside the citadel. It housed a church, a mill, a bakery, a brewery, and other shops, a concept he later applied to all his buildings to improve the soldiers' quality of life.
Vauban standardized the different types of buildings he built. The barracks, for example, had a central span with a main entrance, and on both sides there were 2 spans with 2 windows and space for the soldiers to sleep. Once he figured out his ideal design, he drew up the plans. Then he and his engineers would adapt the plans on the ground. His streamlined approach was an efficient way of working that helped him control the costs of his projects.
This fort, known as the Queen of the Citadels, allowed Louis XIV to show all of Europe that France had mastered the most modern defense techniques and kicked off Vauban's career.
Clerville was demoted to building Colbert's marine and domestic fortifications, while Vauban became the only person leading the sieges and building new fortifications under Louvois, the war minister. He worked for the department that was in charge of war.
Vauban was appointed governor of the Citadel of Lille, a title he would retain until his death. He hired the best engineers for his design office and corresponded with them remotely. With Vauban's presence on the ground now indispensable, he crisscrossed the country to secure its borders.
It took many long years for his skills to be truly appreciated. Notably, it wasn't until the Franco-Dutch War, which started in 1672, that his skills, especially with regard to polyarcetics, the art of siege warfare, were recognized. His big moment, of course, was the Siege of Maastricht in 1673. After 13 days of trench warfare, the city fell. That's when Louis XIV understood that he was more than a builder, he was also unmatched in terms of siege warfare.
A great military strategist, Vauban quickly proved his aptitude for siege warfare. He was put in charge of the approach for the cities Louis XIV chose to besiege. Appalled by the loss of human life during these wars, Vauban developed a method of attack to better protect the royal army.
Some generals took pride in losing 300 men in a bastion attack, but he thought the life of a single subject of the king was worth 1,000 enemy lives. He wanted to save his sappers. He wanted to let gunpowder talk, not French blood. Vauban was obsessed with that. He had so much empathy for the lives of those he put in danger.
To besiege Maastricht, one of Europe's most powerful cities, he borrowed the Turkish technique of parallel trenches and led the siege in a revolutionary way. Some 3,000 meters from the city, Vauban dug 2 parallel trenches and placed the siege army between them. Their objective was to cut off all outside communications to and from the city. He then dug zigzag trenches in the direction of the bastions he chose for the attack. Why advancing in a zigzag? Before Vauban, when trenches ran straight, a hit from a cannonball resulted in utter carnage. That's why Vauban broke up the lines to reduce the number of deaths. The first of these parallel trenches was set up 600 meters from the target. The ditch could hold entire battalions and enough cannon batteries to start bombing the enclosure.
He took 100 cannons and 30 mortars. Their cannons started shooting 600 meters from the bastion, and there were 100 of them. That means that every 10 seconds, the rampart was hit with a cannonball. How could the enemy sustain that? That was impossible. So they retreated from the rampart. At the same time, they kept digging the zigzag trenches closer. It was relentless, and they often worked at night. And when they got to the final rampart, they either dug beneath it or the rampart gave way to the artillery. But in general, they didn't wait until they penetrated the city. The enemy surrendered.
About 350 meters out, they dug another parallel trench for the cannons and mortars. Meanwhile, the zigzag trenches continued until they reached the glacis, where the final parallel trench was dug. Vauban continued to innovate and placed cavalrymen in the trenches. From their elevated position, the assailants towered over the besieged and drove them towards the interior. From that last position, the cannons bombarded the rampart to create a breach. Then the assailants advanced in a secret tunnel beneath the glacis for the final attack.
During the siege of Maastricht, Vauban was able to master one of the most important elements of siege warfare: time.
If Vauban hadn't been the only man in Europe capable of conquering a city in 20 days, while losing 4 times fewer men despite his enemies attempting to defend it, he wouldn't have been this influential.
After the victorious siege of Maastricht, lasting only 13 days, Vauban's siege became a world-renowned reference. His treatise, On Siege and Fortification, was translated in 15 languages.
It was translated into languages like Turkish and Chinese because it was an excellent approach that held up even 150 years after his death.
Vauban became the man of all situations, and while he was never bestowed a title, he did receive a generous payout, which he used to become a landowner through the purchase of the Château de Besançon in his hometown of Vauban.
He was a lord, practically a feudal lord. And every time he was in Bazoques, he acted like a lord. Peasants came to visit him. People brought him gifts. He even participated in baptisms. So he was a lord who owned land, and he enjoyed the advantages that came with that. But he never had time to fully enjoy them.
Vauban often didn't return home for years. The borders were never secure, especially the northeastern border, which he wanted to completely overhaul. To this pragmatic engineer, isolated French enclaves in enemy territory made no sense. To streamline the border, Vauban convinced Louis XIV to return these strongholds to the Spanish Netherlands, as they cost significant human and ammunition resources. He then developed a foolproof defense strategy, a double line of fortifications that defended one another. Some 26 fortresses made up what became known as Vauban's dueling field.
I think Vauban was the only fortress builder who built in the right places. He constructed this line of fortresses that made it extremely difficult to attack, since there was no relief. His understanding that this was France's Achilles heel is what ushered in 100 years of peace.
Thanks to Vauban, the idea of a familiar and manageable kingdom became desirable to Louis XIV. The king set his sights on definitively annexing Franche-Comté. In 1668, as Franche-Comté was under French rule, Louis XIV sent Vauban to fortify Besançon and watch over the territory, which was constantly coveted by Spain. As always, Vauban exploited the city's unique features, including its elevation near Mount Saint-Étienne and the Doubs River nearby.
He saw Mount Saint-Étienne in the middle and the Doubs on either side. You had Chaudon Hill to the west and Mount Bregille to the east. His sharp mathematical mind immediately deduced that if they built on top of Mount Saint-Étienne and placed high walls on either side, the citadel would be out of harm's way.
Vauban began preparing for construction, but just a few months later, the city was returned to the Spaniards along with Vauban's plans. When he returned 6 years later, the Spanish had built a citadel, but luckily not with Vauban's designs.
That's why he wrote to Louis XIV saying, "I know this place, and the citadel may be beautiful, but it's just bare bones." The Spanish hadn't understood what he'd wanted to do. The walls were only 4 meters high. 4 meters was not enough.
Vauban positioned his cannons on a hill across the Doubs and started bombing the city. The Spanish surrendered in just days. The experience altered the way he thought of the citadel. He decided to dig into the rock so he could build into the mountain itself.
That hill is actually a huge limestone rock, which made it extremely difficult to dig into. He began by excavating the summit, digging 5 meters into the rock to level it out. In the process, he recuperated lots of raw materials for construction. The summit was excavated by workers who broke the rock into large chunks, which were then carved into blocks by the masons. Vauban intentionally left the natural rock in place along the sides to give the ramparts extra height.
To the east and west, above the cliff sides, he built 2 huge ramparts atop the excavated rock to protect the enclosure.
Here, you see, it's obvious. You can see that the natural limestone rock was excavated 5 meters down across the entire summit and on the sides. He left this natural rock and built the walls on top of it. That's how he got these walls to be 15 to 20 meters tall.
The fortress walls seem to have sprung up from the very rock to protect the citadel.
That's because he followed the shape of the natural rock. That's what gives it that irregular line. It is one with the mountain. The citadel and the rock are one body.
Once it was impossible for an enemy to penetrate from the sides, Vauban fortified the north and south. Once again, he used the terrain to his advantage.
Because it's on a hill, it looks over a slope. He used that to his advantage and arranged the fortifications in tiers. He built bastion fronts on defensive lines, which he placed at various levels on the hill to create multiple firing areas at different heights.
The narrow site did not allow for the building of traditional pentagonal bastions. So, Vauban opted for demi-bastions that sealed off the enclosure and served as front defensive lines. He even planned for how soldiers would circulate between the fronts. He used the natural cliff sides to build tunnels the soldiers could use to retreat in the event of an attack. One of them is still visible today.
Vauban built these communicating tunnels in this natural terrain.
By carving directly into the rock, Vauban created several tunnels like this one, which are totally cannonball-proof. In just 8 years, the citadel sprung from the rock. But Vauban also had to defend the city of Besançon at the foot of Mount Saint-Étienne.
The city of Besançon was considered geostrategic because it's located in a meander of the Doubs, a loop that naturally protects it.
Although the river naturally protected the city, an enemy could have climbed a neighboring hill to attack. A traditional bastion facing outwards would have been exposed, threatening both the soldiers and the artillery.
That's why he invented something. He created these bastion towers, which were inspired by both medieval and Renaissance military architecture. He built these structures that were tall, but which also had a pentagonal design. He took a weakness and figured out a way to transform it into a great strength.
Vauban designed a multi-story hybrid tower shaped like a pentagonal bastion. On the upper level, infantry ensured close surveillance. Even if attacked, they could take shelter below, where the cannons, protected by walls and a reinforced ceiling, were shielded from enemy fire. Vauban fortified the entire enclosure with these new towers. From then on, he continuously used his invention, adapting the dimensions and use of the towers to fit all his future buildings. 1678 marked a turning point for Vauban. The death of the Knight of Clerville gave him a chance at the title he had long coveted, and he was named the kingdom's chief commissioner of fortifications.
Vauban's career unfolded very slowly over many long years. It was not an explosive career. He was recognized and appreciated for his many talents, but he only became famous much later. Vauban waited until 1688, when he was 55, to become His Majesty's Lieutenant General.
A more honorary title would have made it undignified for Vauban to be in the field. Louis XIV needed Vauban's genius at the border, especially because the following years were the darkest of his reign. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes and forbade Protestantism. All of Europe rallied against him, and the powerful English and Dutch fleets threatened the maritime borders. Vauban fortified the Atlantic coast at the Gironde and Charente rivers, the roadstead of Brest, and the English Channel. At every possible weak point, he built a string of forts to completely block land access with crossfire. On the English Channel, in Saint-Malo, he did something astounding. He built a giant fortress in the middle of the sea to fire on enemy ships and crossfire with other shore-based forts to prevent all access to the Saint-Malo Bay. To this day, the fort defies the violence of Breton storms. Its name is the Fort de la Conchée.
Vauban was extremely proud of that building, and he wrote, and I quote, "La Conchée will be henceforth the greatest fortress in the kingdom, the smallest but the best, because it will have been the most difficult to build. Nothing like it has ever been built." I think he summed it up very eloquently. He was so proud of his construction and thought of it as a masterpiece.
The people of Saint-Malo thought it was doomed to fail. How could anyone build something so big on such hostile terrain?
The prime difficulty of this project was tied to the ocean itself. The ocean is in constant movement, and this area has very high tidal ranges, which means that the difference between low tide and high tide is as much as 12 or 13 meters. That creates a very powerful current. During high tide, the currents can get up to 6 knots. That's practically the equivalent of a ship going at full speed.
But for Vauban, there was no doubt. He needed to prevent enemy ships from accessing the Font-Saint-Normand, the location where they could lay anchor in the shallows and bombard Saint-Malo. Because back then, the privateer city was unsettling. It was one of the richest in the kingdom, and it had a mighty fleet.
This wasn't an easy spot to bombard. It would have required bomb catches, which are not very maneuverable and which need to be anchored to be stable. There was only one place where that was possible, which is exactly where Vauban decided to build the Fort de la Conchée. It was heavily armed with cannon batteries. He built it very quickly, and then no one could attack Saint-Malo from that spot. The English were forced to bring their troops ashore, which was risky, and they lost both times.
Vauban imagined a monumental fortress on this large rock near the Font-Saint-Normand, completely unlike his traditional bastioned architecture.
When he built structures exposed to the ocean, he had to remind his engineers that one can't dig trenches in the water, and there was hence no point in using a bastioned front on sea-bound constructions. So he worked with pure, simple forms, which he built at high elevations that corresponded to the height of the cannons he had to face. A fort with a battery of 24 cannons would have rivaled the best vessels at that time and would have eventually destroyed them.
Only a few hours each day during low tide, workers leveled the rock while preserving a large central piton. Around this central spine, which stabilized the structure, they built the fortress walls stone by stone. The stones were carved from granite extracted on the Chausée Islands, a day's journey by sailboat. The stone was transported by rowboat to the port where it was carved. Then those same boats used the currents, when the sea allowed, to channel the stones to La Conchée, where they were unloaded with a treadwheel crane. Yet the swell could rise at any moment and often forced the sailors to throw their cargo overboard to avoid being smashed against the rocks. Nevertheless, Vauban's team defied the odds and accomplished a feat. In just 2 years, the second floor held a garrison and enormous, ready-to-use cannons in huge vaulted rooms.
Right now, we're in the fortress' most spectacular firing rooms. They're curved. It was incredibly innovative for the time, as it was the first time cannons had been placed in tunnels. Vauban was quite controversial at the time. because the gunners believed that the vaults wouldn't be able to handle firing a cannonball and that the vibrations would make them crumble. The gunners also thought that the thick black smoke that the cannons emitted would asphyxiate the men firing them, who were already deafened from the detonations. But Vauban had already thought of that and developed a chimney system here, which you can see up there, to evacuate the smoke.
Vauban's Fort de la Conchée was the first time in Europe that 48-pounder-long guns, the most powerful cannons of the time, were enclosed indoors. To evacuate the smoke, Vauban developed an evacuation system directly in the rampart. And to absorb the shock of the detonations, he reduced the joints between the ceiling stones and reinforced the vaults with a 1.6-meter-thick layer of sand and debris.
He put in cannons that used 48-pound cannonballs that were capable of making a 99-centimeter hole in the hull of a ship from 600 meters away. Some people thought the casemates wouldn't be able to handle the detonations, but they held up perfectly. The proof is that despite the fired shots during liberation in 1944, which badly damaged the Fort de la Conchée on the outside, the casemates inside were still intact. And that was far more powerful artillery than at the time of Louis XIV.
A few months after the cannons had been installed, the English attacked, thinking the fort was still under construction. But the response from La Conchée was so violent that Saint-Malo would never again be attacked from the sea. Finished in 1716, the most audacious fortress Vauban ever built only fired its guns once. But that dissuasive effort was all it took. The same happened with an amazing defensive system built in the southern Alps. When he fortified the city of Briançon, Vauban was 60 years old, and no terrain was too challenging, not even this steep mountainside.
Because the slope is so steep, there couldn't be just one level of fortifications. There had to be many. Since the enemy came in from below, they needed to counter by interlocking the different levels and forms within each other.
This slope made single-level fortification used on flat ground impossible. Vauban followed the slope's relief to build his bastioned ramparts. They cascaded down like bleachers, giving him 3 firing lines, which could each fire to cover the line below. The cannons were up top, while the lower levels held shooters protected by the high parapet. This seemingly uneven architecture is perhaps the most sophisticated ever designed by Vauban. But it was not enough on its own.
Vauban knew that if the city was fortified, but the grounds above it were not, in particular the areas that were within a cannon range of 500 or 600 meters, if those areas were left open, it would be the enemy who would shoot from there.
Vauban recommended an ensemble of forts that could crossfire to control the entire area. But due to a lack of time and money, his foolproof defensive system was only built after his death.
He wasn't the one who built it. It was his successor, the Marshal of Asphalt. But he foresaw every detail to ensure that, with the artillery that existed back then, there was no way to fire on Briançon. And his successors continued to build higher and higher to the extent that the artillery extended even further up. That's why this city today is kind of a festival of fortifications that span the ages. It was built around the idea that whoever controlled the cannon at the highest elevation would win. It's simply exceptional.
Huge forts became part of the defense of Briançon's high peaks. The Fort de Randouillet, the Fort des Trois Têtes, and the Fort des Salettes were the first to be built à la Vauban, according to the master builder's principles. These principles held up over 150 years after his death. Vauban was at the height of his art. He built the new city of Neuf-Brisach, his final work, which featured his most complex fortifications.
When Vauban designed Neuf-Brisach, he used every failure and every lesson he had encountered along the way. That ability to synthesize is really what made this work so exceptional. When he submitted his proposal for Neuf-Brisach to Louis XIV, it was really a proposal for three very different projects, which also had very different costs. Some revisited an older type of fortification that he had carried out more than 20 years prior, while others featured a completely new form of fortification that he developed based on his many years of experience.
In Lille, the main enclosure is made of interconnected bastions and curtain walls. But Vauban realized that system had a weakness. If one bastion was seized by the enemy, a full invasion was inevitable. In Neuf-Brisach, he replaced the traditional pentagonal bastions with bastion towers to create an enclosure known as the safety enclosure, completely separate from the combat enclosure. To protect the bastion towers, Vauban detached the front bastions from the enclosure. That way, even if one of them was captured during an attack, the city would still be protected from an enemy invasion. And to create an additional line of obstacles, he doubled the lunettes. As a result, assailants now needed to outnumber the defenders by a factor of 20 if they were to seize the fortress.
With 3,000 men in Neuf-Brisach, that meant needing 60,000 men to invade. A fortress isn't built to never fall. It's built to save lives and buy time for military relief to take place. If there are 7 successive lines to besiege, all defended by cannons, that will take weeks. If Neuf-Brisach was ever besieged, it would have lasted 90 to 100 days, which means that an army of 60,000 men would have to be mobilized and held back for at least 90 days. That's all Vauban wanted.
The state-of-the-art defensive lines at Neuf-Brisach follow one another in large ditches to the safety enclosure, in which Vauban built bastion towers. Much larger than those in Besançon, they also held provisions to nourish the population during a siege. In the city, civil and military life revolved around a checkerboard design that was quite futuristic for the time. Vauban had overseen the work from afar. Yet once again, despite being a considerable undertaking, it took just a few years for the Neuf-Brisach defenses to be operational.
Vauban knew how to do more than delegate. He knew how to remotely organize and supervise a team of up to 300 people. There were no telephones and no internet. All of it was done through couriers, the messengers back then who transported the plans in special tubes. The work was also done using 3D models. One model was on site and one was in Paris. This allowed for the stakeholders to communicate about the project. Louis XIV, or Louvois, had the same model in front of their own eyes. They could see in 3D. When you think about the kind of organization that required, it's truly incredible.
He required detailed estimates and expected his subordinates, particularly the engineers working on site, to time track on an hourly basis. That's how he ensured a good execution, was able to respect deadlines, and could also control the construction cost of the strongholds. This type of project management is similar to what we have today. It's an extremely modern approach, but it requires being very meticulous. He was part of the organization, as requested by Colbert, which allowed him to distinguish the people who planned things from the people who actually executed them.
In 1703, Vauban was honored and named Marshal of France at the age of 70. His many years on the road compelled him to write and pass on his vision for the country. Successive wars had impoverished the people who were overwhelmed with taxes. Vauban hence proposed more egalitarian taxes, which he explained in detail in his essay titled La Dîme Royale.
Vauban wanted to apply his sense of rationality to everything, including government affairs. Since the beginning, he believed that everyone should participate in the country's public expenditure, and thus all should pay taxes. He thought that the nobles and the clergy, who were exempt at the time, should also pay taxes. He really believed in a unilateral application of the rules when it came to the people.
Louis XIV supported Vauban's writing, even if it wasn't to everybody's liking. But at the dawn of another war, the state needed money and couldn't carry out major fiscal reform. La Dîme Royale was banned, and Vauban had to print it in secret. It quickly spread amongst the government elites.
Vauban distributed it by hand. He gave one to the president of the Paris Parliament and the Minister of Finance. Everyone wanted a copy. He said so many people were keen on reading it that he thought of printing a second edition. All he wanted was for the people in power in the kingdom to hear his ideas. That's all.
When he died in 1707, the war and his semi-revolutionary ideas meant he didn't get the recognition he deserved.
Louis XIV simply stated that he had lost a man who meant a lot both to him and to the kingdom. There was no official tribute. The country was at war. In Bazoques, however, a lot of people came. There was an official ceremony. He was the local lord, whom people respected. But in Paris, the king didn't do anything more. Vauban simply disappeared.
It took more than a century for Vauban's work to be recognized by those in power. In 1808, Napoleon, who became emperor after the Revolution, had a pantheon erected to honor great men of war from the 17th century under the dome of Les Invalides in Paris. He was determined to include Vauban among them.
He chose Vauban because his writings were well known, because of La Dîme Royale, because of everything he had done and everything he had developed. That's when the world really started to get to know the civilian and military persona of great empathy, a man who fought for his engineers and his sappers, who sought to house them decently, a man of so many humanitarian facets which you don't see in Louvois or other generals of the time, and he became someone respectable, practically a hero.
Vauban's heart was transferred to a mausoleum under the dome of Les Invalides, alongside other great marshals and generals from the era.
The revolutionary, consular, and imperial authorities thought of Vauban as a personality from the Ancien regime who was ideologically acceptable, someone whose ideas were consistent with the values that came out of the revolution. And so Napoleon decided to inter Vauban's ashes in Les Invalides. It was a nod to him as an engineer, a military architect, and as a man who had provided a great service to his country that he was buried in Les Invalides. Vauban was not seen as someone who acted in the interest of the monarchy, but as someone who acted in France's best interest, a patriot before his time. Moreover, the people in power at that time also wanted to honor him as a social reformer. After his death, Vauban was seen as a precursor to the abolition of and the fight against privilege, and notably fiscal privilege.
Behind the architect and the genius military strategist is a lesser-known Vauban. A precursor to the Age of Enlightenment, a humanist and a visionary, who now proudly holds his own amongst the greatest men in French history.